In November 1981, Natalie Wood vanished from a yacht off Catalina Island. Her husband, Robert Wagner, said it was a tragic accident. For decades, that was the official story. But newly resurfaced reports, shifting testimonies, and whispers from Hollywood insiders suggest he has been hiding far more than he ever admitted. Detectives named him a person of interest. The coroner changed her findings. And now, at 95 years old, rumors say he may be preparing a final confession. The man once celebrated as a classic Hollywood icon is facing a legacy defined by one night on the water. Before the incident, Robert Wagner was the kind of star studios loved to shape. He was born in Detroit during the Great Depression, raised in a family that moved often, and discovered early that he wanted to escape the ordinary. When he arrived in Hollywood as a teenager, he was not the wild, unpredictable type that casting directors worried about. He was polished, eager, and disciplined, a studio-friendly actor who fit neatly into the glamorous mold of the 1950s. 20th Century Fox quickly saw potential in him. Wagner built his reputation through a steady climb, small roles, then bigger ones, then the kind of leading man status that made his name recognizable in theaters across the country. He was not the most daring actor of his generation, but he was reliable. Producers trusted him. Audiences liked him. He represented a certain kind of Hollywood elegance, the clean-cut, charming presence that made him seem safe in a way many stars were not. That image grew even stronger when he married Natalie Wood in the 1950s. She was already one of the most famous actresses in the world, a child star who had transformed into a respected performer by her early 20s. Together, they looked like Hollywood royalty, beautiful, talented, endlessly photographed. Their marriage, however, was not as perfect as the magazines made it appear. The pressures of fame, long work schedules, and the expectations placed on young stars created fractures neither of them fully understood at the time. The divorce came quickly. Careers pulled them in separate directions, and both entered new relationships, trying to rebuild their lives away from the spotlight of their marriage. Yet Hollywood is strange in the way it loops back on itself. In the 1970s, after years apart, Wagner and Wood reunited. Their remarriage was a surprise even to close friends. Some called it romantic, a rekindling of a lost love. Others saw it as complicated, filled with old emotions that had never really resolved. Still, in public, the image remained pristine. Wagner starred in new television successes, including detective series that made him a household name again. He projected confidence, charm, and control. People saw him as the steady force in a turbulent industry. But behind that polished exterior, there were shadows forming around him that he could not outrun. The decades that followed would take that carefully built persona and break it open, piece by piece. Because whatever Robert Wagner accomplished in his long career, whatever films he made, whatever shows he led, everything would eventually circle back to one moment, one weekend, one unanswered question. And all of that history would be rewritten by a single night on a yacht called Splendor. Thanksgiving weekend of 1981 was supposed to be quiet. Natalie Wood had just finished filming. Robert Wagner was balancing work and family life, and the couple decided to take a short trip to Catalina Island. They invited Christopher Walken, Natalie's co-star at the time, and they brought along the boat's captain, Dennis Davern. The yacht was named Splendor, a polished white vessel meant for peaceful getaways, not the storm of speculation it would later become. From the start, the mood on board was tense. All four drank heavily that weekend, something even Wagner acknowledged years later. Walken and Wood had been working closely on a film, and tabloids had already whispered about their chemistry. Wagner, who was known to struggle with jealousy in private moments, seemed uneasy about the attention Walken received. Some friends later said the situation felt uncomfortable before anyone even stepped onto the yacht. As night fell, the atmosphere shifted. According to later testimony from Captain Davern, voices rose in the cabin. He claimed that Wagner confronted Wood and Walken about their closeness, something Wagner has always denied. was the cause of any argument. Davern said he heard a glass shatter. He said he heard movement on the deck, heavy footsteps, and tension thick enough to feel through the walls. Wagner's version of the night changed over time, but in those early statements he said everyone argued at some point due to the alcohol, nothing more. The details of what happened next remain the most debated. Natalie Wood had a lifelong fear of dark water. Friends said she avoided swimming entirely at night. The idea that she suddenly left the cabin alone to untie a small inflatable dinghy never made sense to the people who knew her well. Still, that was the explanation Wagner initially supported. She must have gone out to secure the dinghy and slipped. Other boats anchored nearby reported hearing a woman's voice calling for help. They also described a man's voice responding, though no one could identify who it was. Some said the cries sounded frightened. The accounts were scattered, given at different times, and not all were logged properly in the original investigation. Hours passed before the Coast Guard received a distress call. When search teams finally found Natalie's body, she was floating near the rocks, wearing a red jacket, with the dinghy drifting nearby. Bruises marked her arms and legs. The cold water had already taken its toll. Authorities ruled it an accident within days. Wagner gave statements, held steady in front of cameras, and returned home to face a nightmare that no spouse ever wants to experience. Public sympathy leaned toward him. The idea that the glamorous couple had suffered a random tragedy fit neatly into the narrative the world wanted to believe. But the ocean does not erase questions. It only buries them for a while. And decades later, those questions would resurface with more force than anyone expected. For nearly 30 years, the story of Natalie Wood's death stayed sealed in a quiet corner of Hollywood history. The official ruling, accidental drowning, was accepted, printed, archived, and rarely questioned. People grieved, the industry moved on, and Robert Wagner continued working. It seemed as if the story would remain untouched forever. But time has a way of bringing buried truths back to the surface. Everything shifted in the early 2000s when Splendor's captain, Dennis Davern, began to speak publicly in a way he never had before. He appeared on television interviews and participated in a book that revisited the events of that night. This time, he claimed he had not told investigators the entire truth. He said he had been pressured, overwhelmed, and afraid. His new statements were far more pointed. He described a heated argument between Wagner and Wood, one that he believed continued onto the rear deck of the yacht. According to him, the night was not quiet, controlled, or simple. It was chaotic. These claims did not immediately reopen the case, but they created a spark. Journalists took notice. Documentary producers sensed something deeper. Fans who had followed Natalie Wood's career began asking why the original investigation had moved so quickly. The rumblings grew louder, and by 2011, the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department reopened the case officially. Their decision was based on what they called new information, a phrase that sent shockwaves through the entertainment world. The following year, the coroner made a rare move. The department amended Natalie Wood's death certificate. Instead of accidental drowning, the cause now read drowning and other undetermined factors. The updated analysis pointed to bruises that were inconsistent with a simple fall into the water. It highlighted scratch marks and injuries that could have happened before she entered the ocean. None of it proved foul play, but it reopened every question that had been locked away since 1981. This development triggered a surge of renewed interest. True crime shows dedicated episodes to the case. Television networks released specials that pulled in millions of viewers. Podcasts dissected witness statements line by line, comparing interviews, timelines, and evidence that had been overlooked or dismissed. The internet made the mystery feel alive again, and each new piece of analysis made the story more unsettling. Wagner, who had spent decades avoiding the public conversation about the tragedy, suddenly found himself at the center of it once more. Every appearance, every interview, every public comment was reinterpreted through the lens of suspicion. The calm surface of his life had cracked, and the biggest shift was still ahead. Because soon, investigators would say something no one imagined they would ever put on record. The turning point came in February of 2018, when investigators stepped up to a microphone and said the words that Robert Wagner had spent decades hoping never to hear. After reviewing new witness statements, reevaluating physical evidence, and studying Davern's updated account, the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department announced that Wagner was now considered a person of interest in Natalie Wood's death. It was the first time authorities had ever attached that label to his name, and it instantly changed the tone of the entire case. Detectives explained that their concern centered around one simple fact. Wagner was the last person known to have been with Natalie before she disappeared into the water. They also pointed out that his description of the night had changed over the years. In earlier statements, he said the evening was calm and that Natalie must have gone out to secure the dinghy. Later, he admitted there had been tension, claiming everyone had been drinking heavily. In even later interviews, he described a brief argument with Wagner before retreating to his cabin. None of these versions were identical. Investigators said the inconsistencies were impossible to ignore. Captain Davern's renewed claims were also a major factor. He described raised voices, movement on the deck, and moments where, in his view, something felt terribly wrong. Detectives said they believed Davern's new account more than the one he gave in 1981, though they acknowledged he had waited decades to say it. Even so, they insisted the details aligned with physical evidence in ways the original story did not. Bruises on Natalie's arms, scratch marks on her legs, and the position of the dinghy all created gaps that could not be neatly explained. Wagner, through his representatives, strongly denied any wrongdoing. He said he cooperated with investigators in the early days of the case and had nothing more to add. In interviews and in his memoir, he expressed deep sorrow over the loss of his wife, describing her death as the most painful experience of his life. He admitted jealousy had caused tension on the yacht, but insisted he never harmed her and never would have. His defenders pointed out that decades of grief do not make a person guilty. His critics argued that silence does not make a person innocent. The public response was immediate and divided. Some felt vindicated, convinced that the truth had finally begun to surface. Others believed the renewed investigation was fueled more by media pressure than by actual evidence. But regardless of the opinion, one thing was now clear. The mystery of Natalie Wood's final hours had shifted from a tragic accident to a shadowed puzzle with Wagner at its center. And as the case grew louder, the people closest to Natalie found themselves forced to take sides, whether they wanted to or not. As investigators revisited the events of that night, the people who loved Natalie Wood found themselves standing on opposite sides of a widening divide. At the center of that divide were two voices, both grieving, both passionate, but carrying completely different beliefs about what happened on Splendor. Natalie's sister, Lana Wood, became one of the most outspoken figures pushing for deeper scrutiny. For years, she said she felt something about the official story did not add up. She pointed to Natalie's fear of open water, the bruises listed in the coroner's notes, and the delayed call for help. Lana insisted these details had never been properly explained. In interviews, she described her own frustration with the original investigation and said she believed key information had been ignored. Her mission was not about revenge, she claimed, but about honoring her sister by demanding clarity. That stance brought her support from true crime audiences and documentary filmmakers, who often portrayed her as fighting against a powerful Hollywood narrative. On the other side stood Natalie's daughter, Natasha Gregson Wagner, who defended her stepfather with quiet but unwavering loyalty. Natasha grew up with Wagner and considered him the man who raised her, guided her, and gave her stability after her mother's death. She said she did not believe he would ever harm Natalie, and she described him as a loving figure who carried decades of grief on his shoulders. When she produced a documentary about her mother's life, she chose to focus on Natalie's work, her kindness, and her impact on Hollywood, not the tragedy that overshadowed everything else. In Natasha's view, the obsession with the case had taken away from the memory of who her mother truly was. Their conflicting perspectives echoed far beyond their family. Viewers, journalists, and fans split into two camps. Some sided with Lana, believing the shadows around the case needed to be confronted head-on. Others followed Natasha's lead, choosing to see Wagner as a man who suffered a painful loss that had been reshaped into a public spectacle. The result was a strange tug-of-war over Natalie's story. Even people who had never seen her films felt drawn into the mystery, analyzing timelines, reading interviews, and forming theories based on fragments of information. The rise of true crime media in the 2020s only deepened the fascination. Podcasts devoted entire seasons to the case. Online communities debated every detail, from the sound of the voices heard that night to the angle of the bruises on Natalie's arms. The story had become larger than life, no longer just a tragic event, but a cultural puzzle that resurfaced again and again. For Wagner, it meant the attention never faded. Even when he stayed silent, the world kept talking. And just when it seemed like the questions might finally settle, a new wave of headlines pushed the entire case back into the spotlight. By the early 2020s, it looked as though the investigation had reached its final chapter. After reviewing the available evidence and re-interviewing witnesses, law enforcement signaled that there was nothing more to pursue. Quietly, without public announcements or dramatic statements, the case slipped back into cold status. For Robert Wagner, that should have been the moment when the pressure eased. He was well into his 90s, long retired from the roles that made him famous, and living mostly out of the public eye. It should have been a peaceful closing act, but the story refused to stay buried. Around the same time, new books and interviews surfaced from medical professionals who had worked on or studied Wood's original autopsy. Some of these experts emphasized factors that pointed toward an accidental fall, the weight of her jacket, the alcohol level in her system, and the possibility that she slipped while trying to reboard the dinghy. Others focused on the pattern of bruises or the timing of the events that night. None of this created a definitive answer, but each fresh interpretation added more fuel to a case that had never truly cooled. Even the experts could not agree, and every disagreement became a new headline. Meanwhile, Wagner's silence only made the speculation louder. He gave no new statements beyond insisting he had nothing left to add. He avoided interviews that mentioned the case. He stayed away from public appearances that might reopen questions. And for a while, that strategy seemed to work, until tabloids found a new angle they knew would grab attention. In 2024 and 2025, gossip outlets began publishing claims from unnamed insiders who suggested Wagner was preparing a final confession. Some stories said he felt the weight of the past growing heavier as he aged. Others described the idea that he wanted to clear the air before the end. These claims circulated quickly, spreading through entertainment sites, social media accounts, and late-night talk segments. Many of them quoted a single dramatic line from a Hollywood insider. Natalie's death is likely all anyone will ever remember him for if he does not clear the air. It did not matter that none of these claims were verified. It did not matter that investigators had not reopened the case again, or that Wagner himself had issued no public response. The narrative was too compelling, too dramatic, and too easy to amplify. A once-beloved actor nearing 100 years old, a mystery that had haunted Hollywood for 4 decades, and a supposed final revelation waiting to be spoken. It was the kind of story that audiences could not resist. Fact or rumor, it made Wagner the center of attention once more. Every headline, every post, every whispered claim pointed back to the same unresolved night on the water. Age had not softened the public's curiosity, it had intensified it. And now, as Wagner's life enters its final stretch, one question hangs heavier than ever. What will he choose to leave behind? Robert Wagner spent more than 70 years building a career that once defined a golden era of Hollywood. Yet today, many remember him not for the roles he played, but for the unanswered questions surrounding one tragic night. Investigators have stepped back, witnesses have aged, and time has blurred nearly every detail. Still, the mystery remains. Whether Wagner speaks again or chooses silence, the story will outlive him, and the world will continue to decide whether his legacy belongs to the golden glow of his career or the shadows cast by the night Natalie Wood never came home.